with us to give us your sense of what is going on out there. What is the global threats? What are these rivals doing to try to threaten us?
Well, first, let me start by saying thank you very much, Liz, for having me, and thank you to the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition for being exquisite leaders in the forefront of global policy and what it means for the U.S. to be involved globally and how that actually keeps us safer. With the opening of your economic focus here, I think stepping back and looking at the global picture, Richard Haass is spot on. I wouldn't call it an alliance. Much like him, I'm seeing an alignment. It's an alignment against Western values and the outcomes that they think are going to favor a reshifting of the global order. If I were to speak frankly about each of those four countries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, all four of them have a vision where they think they would like to be the global superpower, global leader. So that's where I don't see an alliance so much, but definitely a benefit if they work together to kind of weaken the West, soften the U.S., and erode some of our values and our economy. And you're seeing that happen every single day. We'll just pick on China first. It's a really easy one to pick on. There's so many things China's doing to steal technology, steal intellectual property. Back in 2019, FBI Director Chris Wray talked about the transfer of human wealth. The greatest transfer of human wealth in the history of mankind was occurring right now with this theft of IP by China. Shift to this January, Director Wray has completely changed his narrative, and I think it's a very stark warning for everybody, is that we're not just seeing IP theft, but they're now pre-positioning for acts that could be deemed acts of war with cyber. So that just gives you a sense of how dramatic China's taking that. And they're doing it beyond just cyber. You look at the automotive sector with the BYD dumping automobiles in Europe. You look at some of the other things they're doing to aggressively position themselves as leaders in the tech space, which is, I think that's really, we look at the parallels, and we talked about this alignment of these four adversaries. And I kind of draw a comparison to World War II. And if you look at World War II, we're talking about this power struggle, this dynamics over resources, natural resources. You're talking about oil. You're talking about some of the other minerals and land grabs that were happening during World War II. Right now, what you're seeing is this real power struggle globally over data and information technology. And I think that's like the precipice of where we're at.
Can I follow up on one more question on China? One of the we always focus at USGLC on two numbers that we're watching really closely. That China, as you know, as I know, a number of you know, has more diplomatic, consulates and embassies in the world than any other country. Their Belt Road Initiative, although not at the same level that it was, is still incredibly aggressive. They've invested in Africa alone at 525% more increasing than in the last 15 years. And the whole question is, how are we showing up? When we were in Kenya together, we saw China everywhere. What are you seeing that China's doing, particularly around the economic development space, the diplomatic space, that concerns you, whether it's in Africa or in Europe or any other places that you're traveling in our own hemisphere? What do we need to be focused on in this risk of America not showing up when you see China?
So I think just going back to Kenya, one of the most amazing things, and you see it as soon as you get in Nairobi and you're leaving the airport, you get on the toll road. Yeah. And the toll plazas are all pagodas. So they're saying the quiet part out loud, and they're not trying to hide it. Just think all the resources they've poured into Kenya, the strings attached that come with that, the access to critical minerals, the access to deep water ports in Africa. That's all part and parcel of the threat. Stepping back from just that, I think when you look at leadership in the international organizations, a lot of criticism has come in the last decade about the United Nations and about the U.S. involvement and engagement in these international organizations. I look at the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. Mm-hmm. The U.S. cannot afford to step back. And I think what happened after the 2000s was a desire to kind of let the U.S. step back and encourage other Western countries to take on some of that leadership, take on some of these roles. And what happened when we left that void, China rushed in. Yeah. And I'll use the ITU as an example because I think that's pretty critical. We stepped out of that as a leadership role. The Chinese send in a Secretary General of the ITU, and there is some low orbit licensing that Liechtenstein has tied to a specific Ka band spectrum that may or may not have some really good military use to it. The U.S. military is not engaging in getting that satellite bandwidth. It's owned by Liechtenstein. It's supposed to be used for public good. So China has chased every company that gets the rights to it and tries to bankrupt them. They filed over 200 litigation maneuvers in Europe and the U.S. against companies that have gotten access to those. You look at that, that's the type of ferocity that they bring to the table. And they had the Secretary General from China in the ITU lobbying to change the rules on how that spectrum became available. So when we step back from those types of engagements, we open the door for an adversary to take on leadership, and they're not driving with the globe's, the greater vision.
So that's a very powerful example of the risk when we step back. So let me ask the flip side of that as to where's the playbook on the offensive strategy. So one of the things that we're trying to uncover is when we think about economic security as national security, typically America shows up, very important playbook, but it's the defensive strategy. It's the sanctions, it's the export controls, it's the tariffs. Again, important, but we're less proactive with the opportunities list on economic statecraft, on how are we, doubling down on our development and diplomacy strategy. When you think about all your travels, all your work in the national security sphere, what is the the proactive economic security playbook that we need to do to make sure that we're getting this right?
So I think there's got to be a better partnership between the U.S. government and U.S. private sector on what are the opportunities that exist. How do we use the IDFC, the International Development Finance Corporation, to best position ourselves for the right investments in countries that are aligned with our view? Again, we don't need to have you subservient to the United States. We just want to have people that share our common views, common values, and that's going to build a stronger network. So we spend a lot of time on the defensive measures, and I think they have value, and they've proven quite effective to control some of these issues. But I think there's so many opportunities, especially as you look at Africa, you look at the Middle East, as there's this rapid race to development. And I think while we were in Kenya, they were noting that in 2050, they are going to be the population center of the world. So there's
one out of three workers in the world are going to be on the continent of Africa. And we're not there the way we should be.
Correct. But at the same time, the United States is doing a lot of things that harm innovation. And I think that's the other thing. You can't be offensive at the same time, that you're beating up some of your innovative leaders. The U.S. strength and security rests in its innovation. So for me, we look at across all the things, and I think I led with this, that today's battle is over the information technology space, whether it's data, AI, cloud services, data management, data mining. All these things are very important. But unfortunately, over the last 10 years, the Department of Justice and the FTC have done a lot of things to assault U.S. leadership in these spaces. It's been very harmful. It's been counterproductive. And when Robert O'Brien opened up National Security Council meetings with senior directors every Monday morning, he talked about two things: strength, peace through strength, weakness is provocative. That was like one of his hallmark comments. And the other thing was economic security is national security. And that was the two things he wanted to impart on the senior directors as we were taking on our week every week. And one of the things I sit back and I watch as we're attacking various companies, U.S. companies, we're helping the European Union undermine their success. You look at the CrowdStrike issue that happened in July. That's the result of aggressive regulation from the EU. So we are, and I said this, I think 2 weeks ago at the Nixon Grand Strategy Summit. I said the U.S. is so willing to regulate itself right out of being a superpower. So that's a real fear I have.
So let me ask one last question. And one of the things that got us into doing this is the whole idea of how America shows up. So last month when we were preparing for UNGA, the UN General Assembly, to show up. You and I had a fun email exchange about this, but we decided to do some opinion research. And so we released it in the Wall Street Journal. And what surprised me is in this hyper-partisan arena environment before even more so before the election, that we found just this incredible synergy of where America was feeling about the topic we're talking about. And let me give you 2 data points to react to. So one is that and there was an enormous synergy about America showing up. So here's 2 data points on this conversation. More than 7 in 10 voters, this was on voters, believe the U.S. needs to be engaged in Africa, Asian, and Latin America to advance our own economic interests. And nearly 9 in 10 are concerned about Russia, China, and Iran creating instability around the world and disrupting the economy. So probably this group may not be surprised. I was just surprised not that there was a majority, but there was that vast majority. So last question. What are the risks to our country, but particularly our economy, if America pulls back, doesn't get engaged? But how do you tell that story to voters today, right now, who are uber focused on a hurricane barreling down into Florida 2 weeks after barreling down on the east coast of our country?
I would express to voters that there's a need for a balanced approach. So one of the things I feel very strongly about is returning manufacturing jobs to the United States. But when I say that, I don't mean shut off to the global world. I don't mean let's take jobs away from other countries. I'm talking about how do we grow and reindustrialize as a nation here, and do it through that offensive lens of building partnerships in Latin America, building partnerships in Africa, building partnerships in Asia. I think we can do both. And I think that is where real leadership could be exemplified, is how do we rebuild, create jobs for people in America. You have a lot of people in America who are barely getting by. They're trying to figure out how to survive in a digital environment. A lot of the jobs look at the dock workers. That's a group that's really frustrated. We need to find a way to kind of bridge the gap for them and make them feel like there's a pathway, while simultaneously working with countries that we think we can grow a relationship with, have meaningful impact with, and then essentially create a more peaceful and calm global environment.
Well, first, let's thank Brian Kavanaugh for fabulous conversation. Thank you. I think I could listen to you all day and learn from you, but it is time to move on to our second panel, and let me introduce who they are. You're going to hear from 4 incredible experts with 1 extraordinary moderator. Liz Economy is the former senior advisor to Secretary Raimondo, now at Hoover at Stanford, going back and forth. I just learned from New York to California, an easy commute, and every now and then stops by in Washington, lucky us. Peter Harrell is former senior director for international economics at the NSC and the National Economic Council, and now at Carnegie. Nick Brambley is head of trade policy and economic opportunity at Google, and Josh Kelmer is head of global public policy and government relations at Zoom. So you're going to hear from those that have been in government, those that are in industry, and our conversation will be moderated by Sam Sachs, who, as I just mentioned and Chris mentioned, I'm delighted and thrilled, is our technology lead for our U.S. Global Leadership Coalition's Global Economic Hub. So Sam, over to you. Thank you, Brian.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thank you for USGLC for convening such a great event today. We are in the middle of a transformative technological revolution, even though I'm still using paper here. We are also at a moment when the international system is in flux. And I think ahead of the next administration, this is an important time to take stock of what are the tools in the toolkit to advance American leadership in the world. And today we're going to talk about that through the lens of technology. But when we step back and think about this toolkit, we have diplomacy, military, economics, and business. And I think we have a stellar panel today to talk through how do we think about these various tools and the most effective way to leverage them. I want to start with Liz. And Liz, you've written in Foreign Affairs that the United States has to seize the mantle of change that China has claimed. Like China, the United States needs to invest deeply in the technological, military, and diplomatic foundations that enable both security at home and leadership abroad. So in that context, in your view, how do we weigh the economic impact of national security actions? And as a sort of part two to that, how do we ensure the competitiveness of American companies and the openness of markets around the world with allies and partners? I know that's a lot to get us diving into the deep end here.
It's like is this on? Hello? Yeah. That's like a whole dissertation.
Yes.
I guess maybe to take the first part of your question. So I think we have to recognize, and I'm really interested to have this discussion on national security is economic security and where economic competitiveness fits into that, because I spent a lot of time when I was at the Commerce Department trying to think through how to distinguish among those three things so that we could be clear about what they mean and how we use our tools effectively, and so we don't conflate everything into one. But I'm open to the idea of bringing them all together, so I think that'll be an interesting discussion that we can have. But to begin with, I would say national security is our priority. Right? We cannot be in a position where we are transferring technology and know-how and products to countries of concern and enabling them to use them in ways that are going to undermine our defense, our sovereignty. So I think we have to put that out front and center. But when you take a step back then and say, okay, well then how do you at the same time look to optimize our economic interests? I think within the context of the national security frame, I think about it through the commerce lens, like what we would do, for example, when we are talking about outbound investment restrictions, right? The pretty senior team, reached out to, pension funds, reached out to business that was doing business in China, reached out across the board, probably had 12 different focus groups, and engaged with them, not only to share what, the Biden administration was thinking about outbound investment restrictions, but also to hear what was their exposure to China and what areas of, that might be sensitive in terms of, our national security. What maybe had they learned from the CFIUS process in terms of how should we establish a reporting, infrastructure. So there's a partnership there, I think, that sometimes isn't clear, but Commerce, I think, really believed in. The tariffs, there's a 4-year tariff review process that ostensibly is supposed to enable business and industry associations to come back and say this isn't working and we want to take action to change this. That's another sort of element of it. So I think we have mechanisms where business can be engaged in the discussion around national security, but I think national security is going to be front and center. I should say on export controls, there's there's most of the time that I know of an assessment of the economic impact of an action. And there'd probably be outreach to, if we knew, say, for example, a chip company that would be very affected, we might reach out and say, is there a way that you could modify this chip so that you can use it for gaming applications, but not, in a way that's could be used by China for military applications. So I think on the defensive element of it, there are definitely ways that the government can engage with the business sector, have a two-way dialogue. Then I think to the second part of your question, it's the affirmative element. And I think probably where we want to spend most of our time. But I think, look, we have not had an affirmative message for the business community, I would say, truly, in almost 8 years. And, that to me speaks on trade, which, Peter will talk a lot about. It speaks to the development issues that were being mentioned. How do we, work in the emerging and middle income economies to develop a kind of stack of, training opportunities in these economies, to, research opportunities, to manufacturing opportunities, and then build into that, working with them to establish global norms in ways that reflect, yes, our democratic values and not China's values. So I think there are opportunities there, supporting DFC, supporting Exim, all of these things. We know what we need to do. I think probably everybody on this panel knows and everybody here knows. We just need now to do it. So hopefully that's going to be the, job of the next administration.
Thank you. Peter, you have had the unique position of being dual-hatted with the NSC and the National Economic Council. How are you looking at this question of American leadership, and what is at stake if we have an inward posture? What is an affirmative vision for our alliances, our economic agenda, and our engagement on the global stage look like?
Well, first, I want to push back a little bit on this idea that economic ties between the U.S. and its allies and partners are not deepening. Because if you just, I'm a statistical guy, if you just look at the statistics, they are deepening. If you look at U.S. trade with countries that we would have had in the TPP, it's all way up. I mean, GDP, Vietnam last year exported 25% of its gross domestic product to the United States of America. Trade, U.S. imports from Indonesia, from India, way up. U.S. trade volumes with the European Union up 40% over the last 4 years. Both directions up about 40%. So actually in the statistics, aside from China, where trade volumes are declining substantially, you're just not seeing a reduction in U.S. trade volumes with our allies and partners. If anything, you're seeing an increase. Now, we've not had an affirmative agenda to get there. This is being driven by the fact the U.S. is the best performing large economy in the world over the last 5 years, far and away the best performing among the G7. And, aside from the tariffs on Trump, we have pretty low applied tariff rates. So we're in this weird position where actually the trade volumes are increasing. But because we don't have an affirmative vision, we are neither writing the rules on which those trade volumes are being distributed, right? Because we haven't gone out and written rules for like the digital economy or for rules of origin to keep China out of supply chains or for labor and human rights standards. So not having a vision, we're not writing the rules. We're just taking the trade. And second, we're not getting any diplomatic credit for it. And so despite the fact that trade volumes from TPP countries are way up over where they were pre-TPP, even though we pulled out of the TPP, there's this perception across the region that we've stepped back and aren't engaging economically. And so I think actually for the next administration, whether it's President Trump or whether it is Vice President Harris, coming out early with a very robust, here is the positive agenda, here's what we want to do. And obviously it has to have the right substance, but also the right narrative of we're going to go out and push hard early on our affirmative agenda. We want to write these rules. And in some ways, yes, we want to write the rules. And otherwise, we want to get credit for what's already going on is going to be hugely important. Now, I do think in the substance of that, we're going to have to think through two things. Sort of at a strategic level. The first is, as Brian said, I think the U.S. has made a decision on a bipartisan basis. We want to be a manufacturing country. We are not going to see further deindustrialization in this country. And that is going to pose some challenges if we're going to do trade deals for traditional tariff liberalization, because we might be able to do some, but I think there is a bipartisan consensus. We are going to, at least maintain our current manufacturing capacity, if not expand it. And that's going to force us to think through, okay, well, what else are we putting in trade deals if we're not doing as much access to U.S. manufactured goods? So that's one thing we got to think through. And then the other thing that I think we have to think through in a serious way, and I think there's an opportunity next year, is how we better integrate our trade and our development policies, which we've always had sort of an aspiration of doing, but we've never done particularly well. But I posit to you guys, there's an opportunity next year between the fact that we'll have a new president who will want to set a trade agenda, I hope, probably different trade agendas. So I think you'll have a new president who wants to set a trade agenda. So you have that. And then next year, sort of coincidentally, EXIM, DFC, and AGOA are all up for renewal. So we have three really important kind of development and export promotion tools that are all coming together for renewal. And as Liz said, I think we probably all know, at least the experts here in the room would all have kind of consensus on how we could make EXIM, DFC, and AGOA even more effective. But I think there's an opportunity for the next president to come out next year. Here's a trade agenda. Here's how we're going to fix and make even more robust these major development tools. That will come together to really give us an opportunity, if we can only seize it next year, to kind of rewrite this narrative we've faced for the last, more than 4 years, the last 6-7 years of not having that robust global economic agenda that I think we all in this room certainly know we should have and know we can have.
So on trade, I think we have seen a dramatic bipartisan shift when it comes to trade policy. Josh, in your view, from being at a leading tech company, how do you see trade as playing an important role in American leadership?
Yeah, this is on, right? Okay. It's so hard to tell when you're the one talking. So, well, first let me say thank you to you, Sam, and to Liz and Chris, and Sydney and USGLC. This is a terrific event. One thing I would just sort of say parenthetically at the beginning, completely agree with the premise of the discussion. Economic security is national security. I have found historically the term economic security is malleable. It can be manipulated. It can be, moved around and so forth for different purposes. So I would just encourage all of us, when we're talking about the concept, to make sure we're clear about what it means. I think maybe take a step back a little bit from the question, Sam, largely to agree with Peter. I actually think trade has been, over the last decade or so, one of the areas that I would classify as a little bit of a missed opportunity for the United States. And there are a whole lot of good reasons why it was hard to make progress on trade over the last 12, 15 years, mostly exogenous, mostly having to do with the way the world was changing. But I do think neither the Trump administration nor the Biden administration made as much as they could have made of the opportunity to integrate trade into both domestic policy and foreign policy. And so when I think about the point that Peter just made, that I very much agree with, that whatever administration comes out next year needs to come out with a bold narrative on trade, it should first of all do those two things. It should tell the story of how trade is going to be a part of the domestic policy of this country. In so many ways, I think we view the two as in tension, when, in my view, that's exactly backwards, and there are very few things better than trade for creating opportunity within the United States for people. But secondly, what is the affirmative vision for how trade is a part of our foreign policy? And I think that means a few things. I mean, Peter wrote a terrific paper for Carnegie, I think back in May, about this. And one of the pieces that he discussed, that has been discussed by others as well, is that I think we've got to have, I think the term you used was reset. We've got to reset how we think about the role of a trade agreement and what a trade agreement can do to capture the issues that we're facing today. So climate, infectious disease, and of course tech. And this is where I guess my own history as a trade negotiator and my current role kind of collide a little bit. I have to say, like, it is, and I think Nick will probably agree with this, as any kind of company, but certainly as a company that is a part of an industry that has really played a huge role in U.S. technological leadership. You want your government, you want to feel like your government has your back, right? You want to feel like it is taking steps to open markets, create rules, devise protections, ensure that you're being treated fairly, and not simply because it's in the commercial interest of the companies, but because it's in our national interest. And I think that's where the term economic security is national security comes into play, because there's really, I think, as Sam probably knows, I hate the term digital economy. There is no digital economy. It's the economy, and it's digital now. And so the significance of digital technologies for economic activity are most profoundly felt outside the technology sector in every kind of industry. And so to the extent we are devising smart global frameworks around digital, to the extent we are actually doing some traditional comprehensive free trade agreements to open markets more broadly, we are creating opportunities for the entire economy, for workers across industries in the United States to reach markets, to seize opportunities, and we're enhancing our technological leadership. That relates very directly to our national security. It underwrites our military edge. And so I think it's just critical for whoever is the administration coming out in January to articulate a bold narrative that actually ties together how a new vision for putting together the elements of trade policy are going to drive economic security and national security.
Couldn't agree more. The digital economy is the economy now. And I think that's a great transition. We can't have this conversation without talking about AI. And Google is really leading the way on this. Nick, you've talked about the importance of smart investments and smart regulation. What does an affirmative AI agenda look like, and one that is internationally forward?
Yeah, thanks, Sam, and thanks to USGLC for organizing today. This is just a great discussion. I've learned a lot already. I do think trying to project like an affirmative AI strategy actually does require us to think about what is an affirmative economic security strategy. And of course, economic security can be defined 1,000 ways, and each person will have their own definition of it. But I do think pivoting towards a more affirmative vision and projecting that vision to the world and having something the U.S. can really point to say, this is how you build a dynamic, competitive economy by incorporating technology in a fair kind of way. This is how you help workers who have been displaced by trade and technology in the past, have a real strategy for helping them get along and get by in a world where AI, other technologies are going to have probably a pretty profound role, both in positive and negative ways on the economy. We have not really had a discussion, I think, within the U.S. about how we can really rethink some of the earlier efforts to build adjustment assistance around trade and modernize those to really account for new kinds of harms, new kinds of risks, but also new opportunities for communities to really reinvent themselves and to become part of new tech hubs and tech corridors across the country. So I think if we can find a way to talk about trade beyond the narrow lens through which it's been, I think, approached over the last decade or so, and recognize that I think by funneling so much of the digital conversation through the digital trade lens, we're missing a lot of what the U.S. needs to do to project a vision to the rest of the world around building a dynamic and competitive economy, helping different sectors use and incorporate technology into their day-to-day work, helping small businesses. There's so much more the U.S. has to say around technology and digital issues and AI to the rest of the world than can be conveyed just from a trade lens. You really do need DFC and XM, but also state and commerce and NSC and DHS and other agencies to be part of a really coherent sort of plan there, I think, around articulating this kind of agenda. But 25 years ago in the Clinton administration, IRA Magaziner put out a report that set the stage for a lot of what the U.S. foreign policy advocacy around data and digital came to be in the coming decades. But I don't think we've really done the same exercise since then. We haven't really had sort of a moment to say, this is the affirmative U.S. global technology strategy that we need to advance economic and security goals together. Actually, the one exception to that actually is the State Department, which put out a really great report earlier this year on digital solidarity, which I think is meant to be sort of a counterweight to some of the both China-led and European-led, frankly, visions around digital sovereignty that we've been seeing emerge around the world over the last few years. This really is actually a really thoughtful, well-written strategy and can be, I think, the basis for how the U.S. incorporates a more inclusive, more comprehensive approach to addressing these kinds of issues. The other big report I would point to recently actually came out of Europe, the report from Mario Draghi, former Italian prime minister, which was commissioned by the European Commission President von der Leyen, and really took a careful look at where Europe had gone right and where it had gone wrong in terms of building its own tech economy. And I think this report is one of the most important things I've seen recently because it really praises the U.S.'s approach in a way the U.S. probably hasn't done as much work praising itself as it's engaged with the rest of the world. But the Draghi report basically says that, I'll pull up a quote from it, the U.S. economy has nurtured new innovative technologies and investment and has followed, redirecting resources towards sectors with high potential for productivity growth, whereas the EU is basically stuck in a cycle of low industrial dynamism, low innovation, low investment, and low productivity growth. So this is a really great opening, I think, and AI provides this opening to the rest of the world for the U.S. to give something, both on the technological side and sort of the policy side, to really come up with a framework for how we can think about these things together, to build alliances, to build research alliances together. One other quick example I'd throw out is that yesterday Google won a Nobel Prize for our work on AlphaFold, which is this really innovative system that DeepMind developed to understand how to map the structure of proteins, which are the building blocks of all living matter. And this technology has capabilities to, it's already being used by 2 million scientists around the world. It has capabilities to be used to get cures for malaria, cures for cancer. But we really do need sort of like international effort around these kinds of technologies if they're actually going to accomplish these kinds of goals. The smartest researchers out there aren't necessarily in the U.S. They may be in other countries. And so we need to figure out ways to use data flows, digital trade, and a broader sort of research and leadership agenda to really drive partnerships with those other countries rather than doing this on a go-it-alone basis.
I'm going to do one more round of questions before we open it up. China is often the elephant in the room behind all of these questions, even when it's not talked about explicitly. Liz, are we getting China right? What do you hope to see in the next administration?
I think we're getting China partly right. I think the I think we're getting it partly right. I think, Biden administration has put in place a lot of the elements of a really good China strategy, from the invest part and the compete part and the align part. So I think there are many elements that are looking good. I think we've moved at this point from a kind of 90% cooperative and 10% competitive agenda to a 90% competitive and 10% cooperative agenda. I think where we are missing the ball maybe a little bit is going back to the point that was earlier made about the competition on the global stage. And I think we have not, in fact, articulated our own vision for what we want the world to look like in 2049, 2050. That is the game that China's playing. China has that vision. It articulates it through the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. It's a Global Development Initiative through the Belt and Road Initiative. It's on the march to de-dollarize the global economy, and people can say, oh, they're so far away from that. Why do we even need to be concerned about it? And, I'm not an economist. I'm a political scientist, and so I can't make the argument effectively, but what I can say is that China persists and it erodes around the margins. And so we may think they don't have, deep enough capital markets, they can't play in that space, but I guarantee you that over time, as we've seen just in the past few years, they are going to eat away at the dollar dominance. And so I think all of this is to say we have not articulated, we haven't articulated an affirmative vision in the digital space, but we have not even articulated for the rest of the world what it is that our vision is, the liberal, international order. How are we modifying it to, and its rules? How are we engaging? How are we bringing countries like Kenya to the table to help set the rules? One of the things on this point, one of the things Commerce Secretary Raimondo did is when she went to Kenya, we signed an agreement on AI principles with the government of Kenya. Sat down with 13 different trade and digital ministers from around Africa to talk about what were their interests, what were their needs. So I think beginning to treat emerging and middle income economies as equals, right? Not having the G7 necessarily set the rules of the road and then go out to the rest of the world and say, by the way, here's the perfect set of principles for you, sign up, I think is also an important thing, because something China does really well, right? It elevates the leaders of other countries as equals. Right? Xi Jinping treats them to summits. The visit of Ruto to the United States was the first visit of a state visit in 20 years of an African leader. I mean, that to me is just unacceptable. And so I think there's a game being played. It's not just simply a technology race. It really isn't. It's a huge part. It's really important, but it's a much bigger picture. And to the extent now that you've got Russia, Iran, and North Korea and China working in alignment, right, that game has become so much more complicated and really important for us to sort of step up and work. Let me say one other thing. I think there's an element of our China strategy on the business side of things and the trade side of things that we have not fully thought through. And I think we're doing it in a very ad hoc way. Are we willing to let China invest in the United States, right? Are we really going to keep out their battery companies? Like, is that a national security issue, an economic security issue? I think we can end up going down the rabbit hole in terms of our trade and investment policy with China if we don't really think it through at this moment in time. So I think we need a more comprehensive look at, again, what we consider to be national economic security, right? I was laughing earlier. A former, sorry, not you, obviously, a former Trump administration official told me we shouldn't be selling soybeans to China because they feed the PLA. So, we could really go pretty far down a rabbit hole if we're not careful. So I think that's another element of our China strategy that we don't have exactly right.
So on the question of diplomacy, and I think it's so important, Liz, what you raised about engagement with leaders in all different kinds of economies. Peter, you wrote on X recently that the U.S. really needs to figure out how to get diplomatic credit for the friend-shoring boom our allies and partners are enjoying. There's been an enormous boom in friendly country trade as we whack the Chinese, but the U.S. has just not figured out how to get credit for it. So how do we get this right diplomatically, and what is a sort of offensive diplomatic approach look like?
I spoke about some of this when I was answering your earlier question, because we are seeing this boom in U.S. trade. I do think, and this is a point that's come up, a couple of times on this panel, for the next administration coming out early with a very clear vision of here's what we want, kind of the economic order that we're moving towards, and here's what we want our economic relationship with allies and partners to look like in an affirmative sense. I think just sort of having that would be extremely valuable, because again, putting aside the substance of the Biden administration's international economic policy, it really was only sort of 2 years in that they sort of began to define things like IPEF and what. I mean, just, there were 2 years of lost opportunity, or I think that the narrative got framed in a way that was against us. So I think having, obviously any new administration, they're not going to do it, in February, but kind of by next summer, laying out like, here's where we're going to be here for at least 4 years. Here's where we want to go on the global economic front. And I think that needs to be a kind of, here's how we see the vision for the global trading order. Does that mean, kind of we're going back to like different blocks of trading? What does that look like? How do we integrate development and trade goals? Like, you need to have that vision. I do agree we need to define what the vision is vis-a-vis China as well. That's something that I think the Biden administration has not done a great job of defining what it sees the end state as being, what it thinks kind of over a longer term the economic relationship would look like. I think it's important to get that definition out there. So I think it really is about laying out a vision. I do want to make one other point in this kind of era, picking up on something Liz talked about in this era of strategic competition and technology competition with China. Because the other piece of this that the next administration is going to have to focus on very deeply, and Liz, I think you brought it up in the opening panel. We can do all the protect measures we want on slowing down China's access to semiconductors and all the rest. There are, more than 1 billion very smart, hardworking Chinese people in China that the Chinese government can capitalize on in many ways, and they are going to be innovative, even if we do everything we can to slow them down. So I think the more important part of staying ahead, very important to have all the protect measures, but the more important part is going to be doing the domestic investment and the with allies and partner investment to make sure we keep our edge in AI, and that 3 years from now we are at least 3 years ahead, continue to be at least 3 years ahead of the Chinese. And if we slow down on the innovation front and on the domestic investment front, that is going to be much worse for us long term than really anything else that we could face. So I think that's got to be equally the focus here. But the way I want to tie this together is because one of the things that we hear, when I was at the White House and since, you hear a lot about from our allies and partners around the world is how can we deepen our technological cooperation. And you've seen the Biden administration try to do that with these tech dialogues with the South Koreans and the Indians and what they did in Kenya. And I think the more we innovate, actually the more we can then in the tech space put on the table with these allies and partners in a way that builds and kind of reinforces a mutual relationship.
I'm glad you brought up innovation, and sometimes it can be helpful to be really practical about what we mean by that. Josh, what recommendations would you have for how the executive branch and Congress can work together to really enable an innovation-first approach while also protecting national security?
Yeah, I think there are a few pieces to it. The first is very mundane, but I think actually incredibly important, which is that maybe not part of the bold affirmative statement to the world, but at least one of the very concrete affirmative statements that the next administration makes to itself is how people are going to work together, both within the executive branch and with Congress, because the playing field is so complex. The place where the trade issues merge into the export control issues, merge into the sanctions issues, and then into the military issues is very blurry. And as an outside observer, I don't feel as though, at least over the course of this current administration, that was done sufficiently, in part with the result that Liz and her colleagues and Secretary Raimondo have become incredible leaders on international economic policy and its nexus with national security, but not in a way that is felt as integrated across the executive branch. I think there's also, and a lot of this I think can be blamed on just larger problems and dysfunctions in our politics, but the relationship generally between the executive branch and the Congress when it comes to thinking through, whatever term you use, small yard, high fence, or whatever. There seems to be general agreement in, I don't know, like 60, 70% of policymakers on both the executive branch and the legislative branch sides that innovation is good for the United States. When we take national security measures that affect the economy, we should try to do so in a relatively narrowly tailored way that keeps out the bad stuff, keeps in the good stuff, and allows the constant motion of innovation to continue. But the practical machinery for developing either legislation or regulations or other practices that reflect that discussion has seemed, again, to an outside observer who represents a company that very much has an interest in it succeeding, not to have succeeded. So I think in a way that the internal plumbing of how the government works is something worth investing a lot of time and energy in. And then I would say, I could think of a number of other things, but in order not to speak too long, I would just focus on one that I referenced a little while ago, which does have to do with the role of digital technologies globally and the opportunity that the next administration will have to show leadership in that area. The current administration, unfortunately, stepped back from that role just about a year ago when it took off the table negotiating positions in support of generally free cross-border data flows, prohibitions on data localization requirements, prohibitions on forced technology transfer requirements. That was a mistake. That should be reversed immediately, but in the context of a larger vision that the next administration should set out with respect to digital and cooperation among friends, allies, other kinds of partners who may not be as close to us diplomatically, but who we acknowledge are players in the world, whose markets matter to us, whose influence is important to us, and who we have an interest in having a functional technology and economic relationship with. Whether that happens in the World Trade Organization, I think, is an open question. There are benefits, there are drawbacks to the WTO as an organization, whether it happens in a plurilateral or bilateral way through binding agreements or otherwise, I think are reasonable questions to discuss. But I think those would be the two big things I would recommend the next administration focus on.
On the issue of innovation enablement, Nick, how do you think about public-private partnerships? And at the UN General Assembly, Google joined Secretary Blinken in launching the Partnership for Global Inclusivity on AI. Why are partnerships like this so important to innovation, and what's at stake without that?
Yeah, thanks. That partnership with the State Department, I think, is just one of many that we and other U.S. companies have done recently with the U.S. government and with allies on the issues of AI and AI infrastructure globally. And I think this is a great example of companies coming together. Frankly, sometimes I look at all the different initiatives that Google and Microsoft and Zoom and everybody else has, and like, we all have our own skilling initiatives, we all have our own programs. But finding ways to bring those together and make those actually meaningful and scale them up in partnership with governments is, I think, the name of the game for how you can better target some of the risks around technology and ideally sort of channel that private sector investment in a positive way, both domestically and abroad. I think, so through that State Department initiative, we committed to build a $120 million global AI opportunity fund, which reflects commitments across both the U.S., but also emerging markets in Africa and the Middle East, as well as the Asia Pacific and Indo-Pacific. But I think for these to be meaningful commitments, they really do have to be scaled up as part of a broader plan with those partner governments. So I see this as sort of a new form of capacity building that we can do in this space. I think there are huge investments going into infrastructure around the world right now, especially technical infrastructure, cloud infrastructure, AI infrastructure, and subsea cables. Google alone has built about 3 million kilometers of subsea cables over the last a couple of decades, which feels like a pretty big number. But I think there's also a sense that this infrastructure is out there, but we actually do need to make this meaningful and operationalizable by local businesses, by governments in these partner countries and in the U.S., frankly, as well. So finding ways to tie together that investment plan, which I think the State Department and others are running very successfully, with a smarter approach towards building workforce, building education systems, building new kinds of programs that help workers who have been displaced by technology and trade regain new skills. I think that's the spot where we really do need to think more about partnership. Google has called for sort of the development of a global AI core, which would basically harness both the investment and infrastructure side of things, but also the skilling and workforce and education side of things, and to bring those together in partnership with foundations, with civil society, and with governments. I think that's the kind of thing we could be thinking about more together with these allies right now, as we think about better ways to sort of build this technology of the future.
Please, yeah.
So I think that is so important, and it's something that, actually at the Commerce Department we tried to do with the digital skilling, and Google participated in this, because it goes to Peter's earlier point about how we're not getting credit for trade. We're also not getting credit for investment and for everything that we're doing, because when we did the digital skilling for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Program, so the Secretary wanted to have something that would appeal to the hearts and minds of the people. Because it wouldn't be clear to the economies, the emerging economies in the Indo-Pacific, what they were actually getting out of IPEF necessarily, since there's not market access. So what could we do for the people in the country? So we came up with digital skilling. And when I went out to say, okay, companies come and work with us, I found most of these companies are already doing digital skilling. Virtually out of the 14 that we got, probably 11 were already doing it. But none of what they're doing already redounds back to the U.S. government in terms of reputational benefit, right? It's Google's project, it's Apple's project, it's Microsoft project, so it's Zoom's project. How do we bring them all together in a way that then the U.S. government is partnering, not just taking credit, but actually partnering, and with foundations who are also super active in this space. Ford is doing great stuff in Africa on the digital front. So how do we bring all these parts together and make them work more effectively, but also get some credit for what we're doing? I think that is also part of the future of what the U.S. government needs to do in terms of articulating that vision and bringing it to life.
We have a few minutes left, and we have a lot of great food for thought here, but I want to have a couple questions for the audience.
Very much appreciate the last exchange on digital skilling. Thank you. And I think that's a crucial element, both domestically and at the international level. So I just want to pick up on those comments and just ask more specifically if any of you have thought through which departments or agencies could lead that type of initiative as a domestic, on a domestic level and an international level, and what that would look like.
I must say, so speaking, I think USAID is probably the right place for it. I forget who raised the point about the rationalization within the U.S. government. I think that's a huge issue because, and I know for many of the companies, many different agencies will come to the same companies over and over again to get support for their initiatives. So I think USAID already had work going on in digital skilling. We came in with this idea because of IPEF. But we could do it in partnership with USAID. So I would say USAID is probably the right place, but maybe others have different perspectives.
I think that's right for the international landscape for sure. I think, SBA plays a prominent role in the U.S., and I think that's actually a huge opportunity to ensure that our small businesses are effectively using digital AI tools both at home and to export. The U.S. export rate for small businesses is still quite low. I think there are quite some big opportunities on the table there. I guess the other thing I would say is, I do think thinking about this at a sectoral level is really important as well. So one challenge that the U.S. has, we are certainly in the lead on AI development, but we're not in the lead on AI diffusion across different sectors of the economy. That's where China is clearly in the lead, both in its manufacturing sector, its agricultural sector, and elsewhere. And I do think we need sort of a more consistent strategy to ensure that there are smart ways to deploy and diffuse AI, other advanced technologies in those sectors. Obviously, there's also a big question about jobs when that comes to play. But this is why we need sort of a more coherent approach across the different parts of the adjustment assistance programs.
Thank you. Ralph Winnie with the Eurasia Center. Question on China. 3 disturbing trends. One is high Chinese youth unemployment. The second is multinational companies pulling out. And the third, which is very interesting, is you ask any young Chinese entrepreneur what they want to do. They want to make money. And the government for so long has been able to offer these people a business development network where they can actually make money. But now what's happening is the young entrepreneur is not able to have access, be able to spend his money. There are rules and regulations and taxes and oversight if they even try and spend and or transfer. Talk about the effect this would have on the international economy and how the U.S., say, could take advantage and bring this younger generation more into our orbit and create a new dynamic for international trade.
I could offer some thoughts, but I would kind of like to give Sam a chance to shine here, because not just as moderator, because this is like a big area that she works on. So do you want to say something?
I think China has a lot of domestic issues right now. And one of the things I hear, I've been to China now 3 times this year, and I'm hearing from private sector entrepreneurs and engineers just such a low morale. And I think that is going to, more than any national security tool that the U.S. government is going to implement, I think this is going to be one of the weaknesses which is going to really take a toll, not only on the ruling power of Xi's leadership, but on the country. And so what advice I think would I have? I mean, I think this is where the Xi leadership needs to be responsive to its people and really create more of a space for the private sector and for entrepreneurs and engineers that want to contribute to an innovation economy.
So maybe I'll just add from the U.S. perspective, I think it speaks very directly to our lack of an immigration policy and why we should be, rethinking our border issues and inviting more talented Chinese and others from other countries to come. I mean, there are elements we need to worry about, research integrity and security, and I think they're, at Hoover, we now have an NSF-funded center that's going to be looking at this. How do we maintain openness and yet, protect our research? But I think, to me, that's the number one element that I would take away from this comment. I also, though, would caution against this narrative that I've heard recently in Washington that the slowing Chinese economy and all of their sort of economic and social problems is somehow leading to a less ambitious, strategic China. And that is simply not the case. There's zero evidence to support that China is pulling back. Look at what it's doing in the South China Sea. Look at even the Belt and Road Initiative. The funding levels are back up to where they were in 2018. They've not gone down consecutive years. So I just think if you hear that here, just push back against it, because the last thing we want to do is sort of take our foot off the accelerator when it comes to making sure that we're competitive, because we think somehow China's really going to be slowing down and pulling back.
Hello. Hi. Sorry. Amy English from Policy Advisor to Senator Jeanne Shaheen. The timing of the next administration also is timed perfectly with the new European Commission, and so a great opportunity to set a new mandate, a new agenda. And Peter, you touched on the deepening trade with Europe, but at the same time, as you mentioned, the Draghi report wasn't actually received very positively in Europe as much as I think that we would like it to be. And as you know, I think it's my boss's sentiment that we need a strong economic EU to advance our national security interests. And we're seeing some levels of anemic growth all across Europe, despite increased regulation, which is obviously contributing to that. So what should be on the agenda? How could we steer the EU into a more aligned path to advance our national security interests?
I'm happy to jump in quickly. I do think that this new structure of the European Commission is a bit more conducive to growth and to reviewing, to ensure that the European policy approach is actually promoting competitiveness. I think there's some new systems in place now and sort of a review process where ideally before, Europe does 100 new regulations, that there's some assessment of like what is the actual cost-benefit impact of those measures. But I think trying to figure out ways to formalize that, ideally in partnership with the United States, where we can have a real assessment, of different initiatives before they are in place to see what the likely impact will be. I think it's, it applies on both sides. I think, Europe is perhaps rightly frustrated that it wasn't more involved in IRA discussions early on, and the TTC didn't necessarily sort of resolve that dispute in the same way that I think the U.S. and some companies as well wish there had been a bit more debate and discussion about the impact of the waves of different European regulations that we've seen in the tech economy. So finding ways to do those kind of impact assessments, to have some sense of like a competitiveness focus across the U.S. and the EU, and recognizing, I think, that we do need a strong Europe to succeed globally, especially in the tech space. I think there's so much great research, so many great educational institutions in Europe, but there is not a real process to commercialize and to grow innovation in Europe right now. And we do need to figure out ways to solve those problems, which I think span both the regulatory and capital markets, but also the broader sort of policy environment across our regions.
Yeah.
And I think in addition to what Nick said, it's in our interest for us to have a Europe that is strong in the way that Europe can be strong, which to me means two things. First, we shouldn't expect that the EU, with every mandate, it strives for more of a cohesive foreign policy and defense policy and diplomatic identity. I don't think it's structurally possible, given the design of the EU, for that to be realized in the way that it would be for a sovereign state. So that I don't think should be part of the expectation or goal set. Secondly, I think we have to do it in a way that is mindful of the different meanings of technology and data and innovation within Europe. So it's sort of fashionable, I think, for both Europeans and Americans to caricature each other when it comes to technology policy and innovation and regulation. I don't think that's constructive. They have policy choices. They reflect very deeply felt and legitimate historical experiences. I nevertheless think there are opportunities, say on these digital issues that we were discussing a little while ago, having to do with cross-border data flows and so forth, to make progress there. So I would add that gloss to Nick's statement.
Can I add as well?
Very quick, and then I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
Just on tactics, I actually think we need a different tactical approach to Europe that is less just focusing on arguing with Brussels and more how do we empower voices around Europe that are potentially aligned with us. One area where I give, and those of you know me, I give the Trump administration diplomatic credit. Very effectively on things like the anti-Huawei campaign, going out to allies in Eastern Europe who are going to be easier to pull this way, where they had sort of a strategic relationship with us. And I think actually they did a good job of picking apart Europe in a way that got European voices who are more aligned with us to put pressure on Brussels in a way that this administration, the current administration, has not done a good job of. So I think it is going to be a partly obviously we got to engage with Brussels, but also how do we find those voices around Europe who are more aligned with us, and what can we do to empower them over a couple of years to give them a louder voice in the within Europe debate?
I know we could keep talking about these issues. I want to just close quickly before I turn it over to Chris to say that oftentimes this can be a very Washington-centric type of conversation, and that one of the great things about USGLC is the national footprint across the country. And I would encourage everyone here today to think about how can we bring this conversation to ways that will really resonate with our fellow citizens around the country, and look forward to the work of the USGLC in doing that. So thank you, and over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you so much. I think we are fortunate that we had two really rich conversations this morning. As Sam said, we could be here all day and continue the discussion. There's a lot to talk about. Just to inform the USGLC's work and programming going forward, I'm just going to take a few seconds and sort of summarize some of the big key themes I heard. One is that better partnerships are needed between the U.S. government and the U.S. private sector to leverage opportunities to grow and at the same time address some of the adversarial threats we see internationally in the economic space. Another is that there needs to be a better narrative in the U.S. about what we do about trade. Trade is a growth enabler, so there needs to be sort of a domestic narrative as well as an international narrative to the rest of the world about where the U.S. stands on trade. And finally, I think this may be the biggest theme, the U.S. just needs to better communicate and do more outreach to the rest of the world about what our vision is for what the international economy should look like, what the rules of the road are, and where the U.S. sees sort of its global role and the global growth enabler it wants to be for the global economy. So thanks to Liz and Brian, as well as Sam, Liz, Peter, Josh, and Nick for sharing all the expertise today. This concludes our program. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great day. All right.